Let's move into this conversation next. An announcement that was made yesterday by the presidency that Russian President Vladimir Putin will not be attending the BRICS Nation Summit in person in August this year, ending months of speculation about whether the country would arrest the Russian president on an international warrant. Joining us now in studio to unpack all the things related to international law, BRICS and diplomacy is former ambassador and former chief of staff at DIRCO, Dr. Kingsley Makhubela. Dr. Makhubela, thank you so much for making time for us. What do you make of that statement that came out of the presidency? It said it was a mutual agreement.
Aldrin, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to talk to you. A summit is a meeting of heads of state. Now, it turns out now it's a hybrid summit. It will take both people in person, and President Putin will be joining virtually. But we haven't seen a detailed statement from the Kremlin that really confirms indeed what the South African government has issued out. One would have expected a synchronized announcement to allay fears and really to start even dealing with the question of pundits, because a lot of people are still questioning, is the Kremlin in agreement with what South Africa is saying? But it has obviated a possible legal challenge for South Africa. So it has had South Africa to a certain extent.
In which sense?
In a sense that South Africa has the obligation in terms of the Rome Statute to really effect the warrant of arrest. Now, there's been a court case that the DA took the executive to court, and the executive was reluctantly releasing the details of its deposition to courts, but the court has ruled that the presidency must make that information public.
Yeah. So just quickly on the issue around the lack of a statement, the clarity also from the Kremlin around the participation of Russia in the BRICS Summit. We were told that Lavrov will be representing the Russian Federation. We don't have an official statement as yet from the Kremlin. However, though, they came out denying that they had said that South Africa would be bombed if there is an arrest of Vladimir Putin. And remember that that's one of the assertions that the president has put in his affidavit as well, in his replying affidavit. What do you make of that particular aspect, and how Russia said, let's rather deal with this particular aspect and not the other issues relating to the summit?
Aldrin, Dmitry Medvedev has issued out a statement a few months ago to say anyone who attempts to arrest Putin, they would regard it as a declaration of war. He actually made an example. He says if the Germans were to arrest Putin or attempt to arrest him, they'll bomb the Bundestag. It was not a threat related to South Africa. It was a general principle of anyone who attempts to arrest Putin. Of course, Putin is a symbol of the Russian country. So they will take appropriate action to protect their own president, quite honestly. It doesn't matter who gets in between. If South Africa was to attempt to do that, they would definitely take such action.
Yeah, so the threat being there, and then also a broader conversation again is around the Rome Statute itself, and also the expectation that should there be a warrant of arrest that is issued against a sitting head of state, and you refer to Vladimir Putin as a symbol of Russia, commander-in-chief of the army as well. Is this a conversation that should be revisited within the ICC and all of the signatories of the Rome Statute? That how do you execute a warrant of arrest against a sitting head of state?
Aldrin, there are things that we ought to do as South Africa. There's a need to discuss how do we handle this moving forward. It's not the first time this is happening. South Africa seems to be a playing ground for the ICC. So there's a need for a broader discussion to look at the flaws that are inherently built into the Rome Statute. One of the issues that a lot of people have a problem about is the fact that the Rome Statute, they are the prosecutor and the court at the same time. So there's no independence. In terms of our legal process, you can't have the prosecutor who sits as a judge at the same time. But the unfortunate part, we have migrated the Rome Statute as is into our legal law. I had Vincent speaking this morning, the spokesperson of the presidency, that they're going to start a review of certain clauses of the ICC to ensure that it's in compliance with the domestic law. So meaning that there will be a bit of a review. And I think that review is long overdue. When the Abashir saga happened, we should have gone to the drawing board to deal with that.
Yeah.
I think as a country, the country likes to react to certain things that are coming up. Surely you can't have each time this matter comes up, the courts gets involved and so on.
Okay, let's just quickly go back to that press briefing that is underway, being facilitated, of course, by DIRCO, head of the BRICS Summit. And when we come back, we're also going to have a conversation around the expansion of BRICS, considering a number of countries that have shown interest to join the bloc.
SABC in Durban, and that's one of the key deliverables. Some 15 African countries are attending that, so the partnership also provides this opportunity to create a platform for at least the SMME sector and women in business through this alliance. Also looking at setting up the BRICS Africa Just Energy Transition facility that we have been talking about. As you know, the issue of just transition in terms of energy is quite critical for all of us, and BRICS countries each have their own programs, and how is it collectively that we can cooperate in this, and how is it that we can also incorporate Africa into this process. So there are other key deliverables. We will sign a customs agreement between ourselves that has been negotiated for quite some time. I was just at the Youth Summit that started this past Monday, and the youth are very keen. What we have not done within BRICS is formalize the youth stream. And under our chairship, we hope to formalize this under the leadership of Minister Nkosazana Dlamini Zuma and the NYDA. We finalized a concept note that was approved by the Interministerial Committee about 2 weeks ago. That's being discussed now at the Youth Summit. And on Friday, the youth ministers will meet in Durban under the chairship of Minister Zuma, and we are hoping that will be endorsed. So that will be another key deliverable, that we have a formalized youth track within BRICS, and I think that's a very important development as well. I've spoken very generally about some of the deliverables. There are several others that we are busy with at the moment, creating the Industrial Competencies Center. We have been working with UNIDA on this for quite some time. Industrialization is key for South Africa, key for the African continent, and key for all of the BRICS countries, so a major focus on that as well. Also looking at the future of education and what is it that we can do given the challenges of new technologies and the opportunities that it provides in terms of the future of education, especially with higher unemployment rates that we have amongst our youth, and what is it that we can do collectively in addressing both the challenges and the opportunities as BRICS countries working with the global community. Now, in terms of the summit itself, as DDG Moniela pointed out, there has been major focus on South Africa's chairing of BRICS this year, sometimes for the correct reasons and sometimes for the wrong reasons. There's been major focus on two areas. Firstly, the attendance of President Putin within the context of the ICC warrant, and secondly, the discussion around BRICS expansion. There has been much focus on these two key areas. On President Putin, as you know, the announcement was made by our president that he will not attend the summit physically, but he will attend the summit virtually. He'll be involved in all of the sessions where the leaders are partaking in the traditional summit of BRICS leaders on the 23rd. On the 22nd, when BRICS leaders, of August, when BRICS leaders address the business forum, the closing plenary of the BRICS Business Forum, President Putin will also deliver his remarks virtually. He'll participate on the 23rd in all aspects of the summit virtually. And on the 24th, in the BRICS Plus, BRICS Outreach Summit, he will also participate in that. So although Minister Lavrov will be physically present, President Putin will be involved in all deliberations of the summit. Now, this is not unusual. As you know, last year at the G20 in November in Jakarta, President Putin didn't attend. Again, it was because of his consideration for the good relationship that he has with Indonesia and President Widodo. He didn't want to collapse that summit because there was a threat that if he attended the summit, Western leaders would walk out and the summit would collapse. Now, it was his consideration that he wanted Indonesia to have a successful summit. He did not participate. He sent Minister Lavrov. And again, I think the agreement that we have reached as BRICS countries in terms of this challenge that we had to address as South Africa, being a party to the Rome Statute and the presence of President Putin in South Africa and the arrest warrant, our president, I think, has done extremely well. He's engaged all parties, not just President Putin. This decision wasn't taken just between President Ramaphosa and President Putin. Over the past several months, our president has engaged with all of the BRICS leaders on several occasions. He has spoken to them several times, personally, discussing this issue. As I said, BRICS is a consensus-based entity, and President Putin not being physically present in the summit impacts all the other leaders as well. And I think it shows the maturity and the strength of the partnership that collectively we could come to a decision that, yes, President Putin understands the dilemma that South Africa faces, but he didn't want to jeopardize the summit. He didn't want to create problems for South Africa. And this is the strength of BRICS cooperation, that we could have this kind of maturity and solidarity in this relationship and ensure that we have a highly successful summit in South Africa with his participation virtually, and that all of the issues we have set on the agenda is discussed collectively, and we are confident that the summit will be a success. There's no threat of walkout by anyone. Unlike the G20, all of the BRICS leaders will fully embrace the summit, and so will the leaders of the Global South, in the form of African leaders and the major political heads of the Global South bodies that have been invited to attend the summit. Now, in terms of the summit itself, as you know, it's being held at the ICC in Sandton from the 22nd to the 24th of August. On the 22nd is the business forum. The leaders will address the closing session from 2:40 to 3:40 that afternoon. And that evening, we will have a BRICS leaders retreat. Now, this is unique to South Africa. The only retreat that took place was in 2018 when we marked the 10th anniversary of BRICS, and South Africa put on the agenda that we should review the journey we have traveled over the past decade and the way forward. We're doing this again this year, being the 15th anniversary of summits. And BRICS is a young organization, but I think it's established itself firmly as a powerful voice of the Global South on the global stage. At the recent foreign ministers meeting that took place, where some of you were present in Cape Town on the 1st of June, Indian Foreign Minister Jay Shankar pointed out that BRICS is not a new organization. It's been on the global scene and interacting on global issues for the past decade and a half. So it's firmly established. I think the important point to also remember is that the summit follows a certain pattern. So following the retreat on the evening of the 22nd, and there's no agenda item. It's a free discussion amongst the leaders to reflect on any issue on the global landscape. On the morning of the 23rd, the summit itself takes place starting at 10 a.m. As is the traditional format, you have a closed session where just the BRICS leaders deliberate on sensitive issues, and they also get a report from the chair of the National Security Advisors. In this case, South Africa's chair is Minister.
Well, that is Professor Suklak there on the nitty-gritties in relation to the program of the BRICS Summit that will be happening in Gauteng at the Sandton International Convention Center in August. That is going to be taking place next month. Joining us in studio is, of course, Ambassador Kingsley, speaking to us about the BRICS Summit, but also the Russia-Africa Summit that will be taking place next week. Let's just first start with what the Prof had to say there. He obviously says that BRICS is still a young organization, but lots of interest that have been expressed in joining the BRICS bloc. What do you make of this intention to expand the BRICS bloc?
The intention to expand, it's good. However, the challenge is the modalities of this expansion. I mean, Anil just confirmed that there are 15 heads of state from Africa who will be attending. One would have hoped for a total different approach, because having 15 heads of state from Africa in other areas, it's a huge conference. It's going to become a talk show. It won't be very strategic in terms of the issues. South Africa should have taken the initiative to mobilize within the existing framework in Africa, the regional economic blocs. Take representative of regional economic blocs to come and participate here, because it's already provided for the integration of Africa in the Constitutive Act of the Union, that RECs will play a critical role in facilitating that. That would have been much better. I think even the envisaged expansion that would include Africans to be useful if they can start to look at doing it from RECs and looking at strong anchor countries within the RECs. South Africa is one. In West Africa, you think about Nigeria. East Africa, you think about Kenya. Because those are economic powerhouses that are really integrated in their sub-region. Mm-hmm. Then the discussion will be much more fruitful. I mean, a large number of heads of state making speeches.
15 is a huge number.
Only from Africa.
And it almost sounds like it comes across as an inauguration,
Absolutely.
Which is more about celebration and not really about discussion.
About discussions. And there are crucial issues that are going to be debated here. The issue around the money, the monetary exchange within the BRICS countries, which Russia is pioneering that. But also there's a bigger picture that is emerging, that South Africa has to start engaging with that. You have the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which is a well-established international organization with secretariat. BRICS is not an international organization. It's an informal platform for discussion. And you have duplication. Now, this month, again, on the 27th, you are having the Russia-Africa Summit. You have the China-Africa Summit. Is this not appropriate time to start discussing how do we merge this within the BRICS, and how do we look into migrating the BRICS into the Shanghai Cooperation Agreement? Because it's creating a lot of
What would the effect of that be?
The effect of that would be the application of all the members who are in BRICS to be affiliated to the Shanghai Cooperation Agreement. There are countries that are having observer status. There are countries that have joined the Shanghai Cooperation Agreement. If you look at the Shanghai Cooperation Organization and the BRICS, the intention are basically the same. And I think there's a need for a strategic discussion around these two organizations, because they're going to create fatigue of conferences with time.
Yeah, and speaking about the Russia-Africa Summit that is taking place next week, when we spoke after that visit of the heads of states as well as heads of government, you mentioned some of the reservations that you had around the proposals that were put on the table, the 10-point plan that they have. Do you still hold those reservations?
Aldrin, if you have a mediation team, the principle is that the mediation team should remain neutral on issues under dispute. It was not about how these countries relate to the concept of sovereignty, how they relate to the question of the children that were taken from some of the conflict area. Those are issues under dispute. They should have been left to the parties under dispute. As a mediator, you don't take side. You allow parties to ventilate their issues. Now, the African team that went there, they started articulating their own views where they stand on these issues. It was not all about them. It was about disputants. And I think as a result of that, they compromised their neutrality in terms of helping the parties to reach a solution.
Yeah. Well, as you heard, the argument from Kingsley Makhubela was that actually, South Africa, for instance, with its non-alignment stand, has been vindicated, yet you make the conclusion that based on the 10-point plan, that means that there was actually a stance that has been taken, which is different to being non-aligned.
Absolutely. Our president made pronouncement that the children that are in Russia must be sent back, that we, as the African delegation, we believe in the centrality of sovereignty of the country, and we think there must be withdrawal. Those are issues under dispute. Those are issues that are causing the conflict. Was it appropriate for mediators to start making pronouncement about where they stand? I don't think they should have done that.
Yeah. Just a final one is the incident that happened now in the Joburg CBD. I'd love to hear your take on it. The explosion and then the collapse of Bree Street, or partially at least the collapse of Bree Street. What do you think is going on here, and what should happen going forward when it comes to looking at critical infrastructure and also the maintenance of that infrastructure?
You hit, that's the issue, maintenance of infrastructure. It seems now no one knows what is the cause. equally says no, there's no indication of any gas leakage, but it goes back to the maintenance of infrastructure. I think we're running a serious problem. Our infrastructure is becoming hazardous to the people, the bridges, everything. There's a need really to go back to infrastructure. For the next MTF period, the government has allocated about close to 1 trillion rand to manage the infrastructure. Are we seeing the results of that? No. The problem is that, again, we go back to the collapse of infrastructure and lack of maintenance because of corruption. We've seen it in terms of the water system in Amanskraal. So the basic infrastructure is collapsing. And I think that's one thing that we as citizens, we need to stand up and really hold those who are in power accountable in terms of poor maintenance of our infrastructure.
Yep. Have we lost the focus on maintenance? Because remember that there was the Office of the Investment in Infrastructure that was set up by the president, and it was headed by Dr. Kingsley Makhubela. I don't know what has happened to that office since now he's the Minister of Electricity. But part of that infrastructure office, should the component also be investment in maintenance? We know what is done to Eskom, for instance.
The capacity of the local government is a huge problem. If you look at the Auditor General's finding now in terms of the challenges we're seeing at the local government, is so huge. And we're not going to resolve that until we capacitate that. I mean, there's a report that came out that about 300 elected officials in KZN, they cannot read or write. It's a huge problem. You can't get people who are legislating laws, who are implementing this infrastructure, rehabilitation and so on. They're unable to read. And as a result, criminals are thriving. Syndicates are starting to emerge all over. And I think it shows weaknesses of the state. I hear people talking about South African state has failed. Really, as a political scientist, I find it very difficult to understand that the failure of Eskom does not mean the failure of the state. We must look at the totality. What do we mean by failure of the state? Of course, there are weaknesses of failure of the state. The government is starting to lose control. Criminal syndicates are starting to run us. Those are issues. Those who are legislating laws are starting to fail. The executive is not held to account. So you are starting to see serious elements of failure of the state. And I think until we nip this thing in the bud, our state is in danger of failing.
Ambassador, thank you so much for your time.
It's always a pleasure.
Thank you so much. That is former Ambassador Dr. Kingsley Makhubela. We're going to take a quick break and the agenda continues after that.